If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I had always dreamed of living in a small town where life moved at a slower pace and the familiar faces of neighbors brought a comforting sense of belonging. The idea of peaceful evenings spent in front of a crackling fire, with the scent of pine wafting in from outside, seemed idyllic. So when I landed a teaching job in a tiny village tucked away in the woods of Washington, I seized the opportunity with open arms. The town was called Ashwood, a name that conjured images of rustic charm, and it lay hidden deep within the forest, accessible by only one winding road. Driving into Ashwood for the first time felt like stepping into a storybook. The tall trees formed a natural arch overhead, their branches swaying gently as if they were watching my approach. I brushed aside the strange feeling that crept into my mind. I was simply excited for a fresh start. Ashwood promised everything I longed for: solitude, nature, and a quaint old house that was available for rent at an unbelievably low price. I moved in late summer, just as the school year was about to kick off. The first week was a dream. The locals were friendly but distant, not in a rude way, but in a manner common to those who had lived their entire lives in the same place, where strangers came and went like the changing seasons. My house was perched at the edge of town, right where the woods began, and from my back porch, all I could see were trees stretching for miles. The tranquility of Ashwood was mesmerizing, but sometimes it felt too quiet. At night, the silence pressed in around me, and I'd wake up with the unsettling sensation that someone was watching me through the windows. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, everything was new. New town, new job, new life. I was bound to feel a little jumpy. About a month into my stay, something strange happened one evening. After finishing my lesson plans for the next day, I settled onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, soaking in the cool air as the first hints of autumn brushed against my skin. That's when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. At first, I thought it was just someone with a flashlight, perhaps a camper. But as I focused on it, I realized it was hovering, unmoving between the trees. Unnerved, I got up and went inside, locking the door behind me. I dismissed it as nothing more than a passerby, but that night I was jolted awake by the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves outside, but then I realized it was coming from inside the house. Sitting up in bed, my heart raced as I strained to hear. The whispers were faint, like a dozen voices murmuring just below the surface of the air. Too quiet to make out any words. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping through the dark house to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had started, and I stood in the middle of my living room, feeling foolish. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of my coworkers, Hannah, who had lived in Ashwood her entire life. She gave me a strange look and said, "Sometimes the wind plays tricks out here. You'll get used to it." I wanted to ask more, but the conversation shifted, and I let it go. That night, however, the whispers returned. I woke up again, drenched in sweat, the same murmurs filling the air around me, but this time they were louder. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It felt like they were all around me, in the walls, in the floor. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. That's when I saw it. The light, the same one from before, flickering deep in the woods. Only now there were more, perhaps a dozen, maybe 24, all hovering just beyond the tree line like lanterns swaying in the breeze. I should have called the police. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was some local tradition or festival. Maybe I was just stressed and imagining things. The next day, I went back to the diner for lunch. It was a Friday, and the place was packed with locals. I casually mentioned the lights to a group sitting nearby. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at me as if I had said something offensive. "You shouldn't go near the woods at night," an older man muttered. "Best to stay inside when it gets dark." I laughed it off, but inside I felt rattled. Why wouldn't anyone explain what was going on? Why did they all act like the woods were something to fear? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers. They didn't come, but the light did. Around midnight, I saw it flickering again through my bedroom window, closer this time. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed my coat and flashlight and stepped outside. I had to know what it was. Maybe it was just kids messing around, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I walked through the yard and into the trees, my breath coming out in shaky puffs. The light stayed ahead of me, always just out of reach. "Hello," I called out, but no one answered. The deeper I went into the woods, the thicker the trees became. The air turned cold, unnaturally so, and my flashlight flickered. The light ahead grew brighter. Suddenly the ground beneath my feet felt wrong. It was soft, like I was walking on a thick layer of leaves. I knelt down and brushed them aside. Beneath the leaves were stones. No, not stones, gravestones, old and crumbling, covered in moss. There were dozens of them hidden beneath the forest floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to leave, but the light was gone. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. Panic surged through me, and I ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, branches scratching at my face and arms. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached my house, I slammed the door behind me, locking it, gasping for air. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, just outside the window. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about the job, the town, or any of it. I just wanted to get out. But when I drove to the edge of town, something stopped me in my tracks. An old, weathered sign, covered in vines. It had been hidden by the trees before, but now it was clear as day. Ashwood Cemetery, established 1846. My heart sank as I stared at the sign. The gravestones in the woods were real, but this wasn't just a cemetery. This was a town. How could the whispers start again, louder now, rising from the trees? I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. The lights, dozens of them, flickering through the forest, moving toward me. My heart raced, and I floored the gas pedal, not stopping until I was miles away, past the forest, past the town, and out onto the highway. I never went back. I searched for Ashwood online after that, combing through records and maps, but it was as if the town had never existed. No history, no traces, swallowed by the forest long ago, forgotten by time. But I remember it. I remember the lights. Every night when darkness falls, I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back to Ashwood. I'll never go back. Not again. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer, if I had followed the lights into the heart of the woods. And I wonder who or rather what, is still out there, waiting for me to return. I first heard about Ashford by accident, a chance encounter that would lead me down a path I never expected. I was driving from Boston to Portland, taking the scenic route through New England's back roads, when my car broke down in a sleepy little town. The mechanic, an older man with grease-stained hands, told me it would take a couple of days to get the part I needed. With some time to kill, I found myself in a quaint diner, surrounded by the smells of coffee and bacon, where fate would introduce me to Ashford. It was one of those conversations you stumble upon without meaning to. Two old men sat at the corner booth, their voices low and conspiratorial. I leaned in slightly, pretending to focus on my menu, but their hushed tones caught my attention, especially when I heard the name Ashford. I had driven through this part of Maine dozens of times and thought I knew every town within 100 miles, but I had never heard of Ashford before. Well, you know, one man said, his voice gravelly, before trailing off. The other grunted, glancing around as if someone might be eavesdropping. They should have let that place die when it wanted to, he said. But now it's still out there. You go looking for it. You won't like what you find. Those words piqued my curiosity. A town that wasn't on any map? I had spent years hiking through remote parts of Maine, photographing ghost towns and abandoned places. The idea of a lost town was too tempting to pass up. After the two men left, I called over to the waitress. "Do you know where Ashford is?" Her hand froze halfway to the coffee pot, and she looked at me, eyes wide, as if I had just said something I wasn't supposed to. "No," she replied flatly, turning away, but not before I noticed the tremor in her hand. That sealed it. I had to find Ashford. The next morning, after poking around a few local libraries and coming up empty, I asked the mechanic if he knew anything more. He shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "You want Ashford? You gotta head north toward the foothills. But listen, don't go there. Some things are better left alone." I should have listened to him, but I didn't. I set out that afternoon, following his vague directions. The road narrowed as I drove, turning from paved to gravel, and then to little more than dirt as the forest thickened around me. The trees here were ancient, towering over the road like sentinels, blocking out the sunlight and creating a canopy of green. My GPS gave up, and I had to rely on instinct, following the few signs that pointed toward Ashford Ridge. By the time I saw the first building, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. Ashford appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting, hidden just out of sight. The buildings were old, very old, wooden houses with sagging roofs and darkened windows. The streets were empty. There were no cars, no people, nothing. I parked at the edge of what must have been the main street and got out. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of stillness you only find in places long forgotten. I started walking down the street, my footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. Every house I passed was the same. Abandoned windows covered in grime, doors hanging off their hinges. The town felt untouched by time, like it had been frozen in place, except for one unsettling detail. There were lights on in some of the houses, not the warm glow of electricity, but faint, flickering lights, like candles burning in the windows. I tried knocking on a few doors, but no one answered. The houses were locked tight. I found myself in front of what looked like an old general store, its sign faded and unreadable. The windows were broken, but inside I saw movement. Something shifting in the shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. No answer. Compelled by curiosity, I walked in. The air inside was musty, thick with dust, and the shelves were still stocked with ancient goods, cans of soup, jars of preserves, all covered in a layer of grime. It was like the people had left in a hurry, but no one had bothered to come back. At the back of the store, I found a staircase leading down into what looked like a cellar. The door at the top was open, and faint whispers echoed up from below. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but something compelled me to move forward. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step making me feel more and more like I was descending into something I couldn't come back from. The whispers grew louder, not voices exactly, but more like a sound, a presence. The cellar was empty when I reached the bottom, just a dirt floor and wooden beams holding up the ceiling. But in the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of old wooden mannequins. They were lined up in a circle, dressed in what looked like antique clothing, tattered dresses, old suits, all dusty and decayed. Their faces were blank, but their heads were turned toward the center of the circle, where a single candle flickered on the ground. The whispers stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at them, feeling like something was watching me, waiting. The air grew colder, and I swear I could hear something shifting behind me, but I was too terrified to turn around. Finally, I bolted. I ran out of the store, back to my car, and sped down the road, not caring if I hit a tree or skidded off into the woods. I just needed to get out. I didn't sleep that night. The images of the mannequins, the whispers, the lights, none of it made sense, but it stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts. The next morning, I packed up my things, retrieved my car from the mechanic, and left that part of Maine for good. But Ashford never left me. It's been months now, and I can't stop thinking about that town. I've searched everywhere for information, but there's nothing. No records, no history, not even a mention on any old maps. Then 2 nights ago, the whispers came back. I was lying in bed when I heard them, faint at first, just like in the cellar. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced it was just my imagination. But then I saw the light out the window. Deep in the woods behind my house, there was a faint flickering glow, just like the candles in Ashford. It was far away, barely visible, but it was there. Last night, it was closer. And tonight, I can already hear the whispers again, louder now, like they're right outside. I don't know what's coming for me, but I think it followed me back from Ashford. Whatever that town is, whatever it was, I think it wants me to return, but I won't go back. Not until it comes for me, and I know it will. I never intended to end up in Pine Hollow. It was one of those towns you stumble upon when you're lost, tucked deep in the dense Maine woods, forgotten by time and progress. I had set out with high hopes, seeking a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the bustling city for a few days. But fate had different plans for me. Somewhere back on Route 12, my GPS failed, leaving me to navigate through a maze of winding roads shrouded in thick fog and bordered by towering pines. I felt the weight of isolation settle in, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. I had no idea that I was driving deeper into a place I never knew existed. As I pulled into town, the first thing I noticed was the sign at the entrance. Welcome to Pine Hollow. Population 326. The paint was chipped and barely legible, as if it had faded into obscurity along with the town itself. Pine Hollow looked like a place frozen in time, where life moved at a slower pace, or maybe had simply stopped altogether. Main Street was lined with old weathered buildings, an antique store, a diner, a post office that appeared long unused. But the silence struck me first. Even in the middle of the day, there were no sounds. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet. I pulled up to the diner, thinking it would be a good place to ask for directions. The neon sign in the window flickered faintly. Open, though the place looked anything but welcoming. As I stepped inside, the smell of old grease and something sour hit me like a wall. A few patrons were scattered at the counter, an old man in a trucker cap, a woman in a tattered apron, and a younger guy staring blankly at the wall. Not one of them looked up when I entered. It was as if I didn't exist. Excuse me, I said, clearing my throat. The woman behind the counter blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. I'm a little lost. Do you know the quickest way to get back to Route 12? She didn't answer immediately, just stared at me with dull eyes. After an uncomfortable pause, she finally spoke. Ain't no quick way back from here. You're in Pine Hollow now. Her voice was flat, empty, as if she had recited the same line 100 times before. I glanced at the other patrons, but they still didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. Could you at least point me in the right direction? I muttered. She didn't respond, just picked up a dirty rag and began wiping the counter, though it didn't seem to get any cleaner. Feeling more uneasy by the second, I turned to leave. But just before I reached the door, the old man at the counter spoke up. Once you're here, there ain't no leaving. I stopped, his voice raspy like he hadn't used it in a long time. Slowly, I turned back to face him. His eyes were fixed on me now, dark and glassy, as if something vital was missing behind them. Excuse me? I asked, forcing a smile. What do you mean by that? He didn't answer, just looked past me toward the window. I followed his gaze and saw what he was staring at. The fog outside had thickened, curling around the buildings like it was alive. You're not the first, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and you won't be the last. I didn't wait to hear more. A sense of urgency surged through me, and I hurried back to my car, the feeling of eyes on my back as I pushed through the diner door. Outside, the air felt heavier, colder. The fog had rolled in so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I wasn't about to stick around to figure out what the old man meant. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped down the road, desperate to get out of that place. But Pine Hollow had other plans. I must have driven in circles for hours. Every road I took led me back to the same stretch of Main Street. The fog seemed to swallow everything beyond the town's limits, and no matter which way I turned, I always ended up back where I started. Back in Pine Hollow. As daylight faded, so did any hope of escape. I parked the car in front of an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. With no choice left, I set out to explore the town on foot, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help. As I wandered through the deserted streets, I noticed something odd. The buildings looked the same as when I first arrived, but there were small details that felt wrong. The windows were dark, yet every so often I caught a glimpse of movement inside, shadows flitting past, as if something or someone was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I came across an old house at the edge of town, its paint peeling and windows cracked. A light glowed warmly inside, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I don't know why I went inside, but something about that light felt different, as if it was calling me. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the house was in shambles, furniture covered in dust, wallpaper peeling from the walls. But the light, a flickering oil lamp in the corner, seemed to hold a strange pull, as though it contained some kind of answer. As I reached out to touch it, a voice spoke from the shadows. You shouldn't have come here. I spun around, heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She looked out of place, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair in loose waves framing a face far too pale. Her eyes were filled with fear. Who are you? I demanded. What is this place? Her gaze shifted to the lamp, and her voice trembled. This town, it's not what it seems. You have to leave before they find you. Who? I asked, my voice rising in panic. Who's going to find me? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the window. Look, she whispered, her voice shaking. They come with the fog. I looked out the window, my breath catching in my throat. Through the thickening fog, I saw them, figures, dozens of them, moving silently between the trees and houses. Their shapes were human but wrong, like shadows cast in the wrong direction. They moved unnaturally, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, as if they didn't quite belong to this world. "What the hell are those?" I whispered, backing away from the window. "They're what's left," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "The town takes people. It traps them here, and once the fog comes, it's too late." A chill ran down my spine. "How do I get out?" She shook her head. "There's no way out, not once you've seen them." I refused to believe it. I bolted for the door, determined to escape. But the moment I stepped outside, I saw them. The figures were closer now, moving toward me, their faces hidden in the fog. The whispering began, low and unintelligible, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I ran. I don't know how far or for how long, but the town seemed to stretch on forever. Every street looked the same, every building a mirror of the last. And the fog, it was everywhere, thick and suffocating, filled with those dark, twisted figures. At some point, I collapsed, my legs giving out beneath me. The whispering grew louder, closer until I could feel the cold breath of the figures at my back. Then, darkness. I woke up in my car, the sun shining, the fog gone. Pine Hollow looked different in the daylight, normal almost, but the town was just as empty, just as silent. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work the same in this place. I've tried to leave, but the roads always lead me back. The people, the real ones, are gone, replaced by the shadows that watch me from the fog. If you ever find Pine Hollow, don't stop. Don't ask for directions. Don't go inside. Because once the fog comes, you'll never leave, and neither will I. I wasn't supposed to end up in Blackwater. It was one of those small, forgotten towns on the edge of nowhere. The kind that no one ever talks about. Not intentionally, anyway. My trip was supposed to take me straight through the Appalachian backroads, where winding roads promised picturesque views of nature. However, a wrong turn led me deep into the mountains, further away from civilization than I had ever been. By the time my phone lost signal, I knew it was already too late to turn back. As the sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the narrow road, a sense of unease settled over me. My gas tank was nearly empty, and every mile felt like I was driving deeper into a place that wanted to keep me. That's when I saw the sign, Blackwater, population 512. The letters were faded, and the sign leaned to one side as if it hadn't been maintained in years. I figured I'd stop, ask for directions, and maybe fuel up if there was a gas station. But as I pulled into the town, something immediately felt wrong. It wasn't just the stillness, though that was unnerving enough. It was the absence of life. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and quiet, with no cars, no people. Nothing but a chilling silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. I pulled up to what looked like a general store. Its windows were coated in dust, and the open sign dangled crookedly on the door. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I approached the entrance, pushing the door open. I half expected it to be locked, but it creaked loudly, giving way. The smell hit me first. A musty, damp odor that reminded me of a basement left untouched for years. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked with canned goods, their labels faded and peeling. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out, hoping someone would hear me. No response. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked toward the counter, where a bell sat tarnished and rusty. I rang it once, twice. Still, no one came. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a soft creak behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The door had drifted shut, sealing me in with the stillness. I should have left right then, but I needed gas and directions. Maybe there was someone in the back. Feeling an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread, I stepped behind the counter, as if breaking some unspoken rule. I moved deeper into the store and found a narrow hallway leading to a door marked office. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see that the room beyond was dark. "Hello?" I called again, my voice wavering slightly. There was a sound, faint like a whisper, or maybe just the wind through a crack in the window. But it didn't feel like wind. I took a step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. I reached out to push the door open, when suddenly, the temperature in the hallway dropped. I could see my breath now, hanging in the air like a ghostly mist. My heart hammered in my chest as the door creaked all the way open on its own. There, in the dim light of the office, I saw it. A figure stood motionless by the window. At first I thought it was a person, a woman maybe, judging by the long, tattered dress she wore. But something about her was off. Her movements were too stiff, too unnatural. And then she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to stare through me. Not at me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural moan that sent icy terror flooding through my veins. I stumbled back, crashing into the shelves as I tried to turn and run. The cans clattered to the floor, but I barely heard them over the pounding in my ears. I bolted for the front door, not daring to look back, and slammed through it into the cold night air. The town outside was just as empty, but the stillness had been replaced by something far worse. The streets were now shrouded in mist, a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the ground like it was alive. Through that fog I saw them, figures just like the woman, walking silently through the town. Their movements were slow, deliberate, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They moved in and out of the shadows, fading in and out of sight like wraiths. My stomach churned with dread. These weren't people. They were something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Panicking, I ran to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As soon as I turned the ignition, the headlights flickered on, cutting through the fog. But the light didn't reveal anything comforting. More figures, dozens of them now, moving toward me. Their faces were pale, expressionless, their eyes dark voids. I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the tires as I sped backward, desperate to get away. But no matter how fast I drove, the town seemed to stretch on forever. Every street looked the same, winding and narrow, leading me deeper into Blackwater. Then I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its lights flickering weakly in the fog. I pulled in, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could fuel up and find a way out. The pumps were old and rusted, but they still worked. I filled up as quickly as I could, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the figures drew closer. Just as I was about to get back in the car, a voice called out from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. It was a man's voice, weak and hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in years. I turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway of the gas station's tiny store, was an old man. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, but his eyes were alive with fear. "You have to leave," he rasped. "Now, before they take you too." "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The people of Blackwater," he said, his voice trembling. "They've been dead for years, but the town won't let them rest. And now that you've seen them, it won't let you leave either." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I have to get out of here." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a deep, hopeless sadness. "Once you're in Blackwater, you belong to it. The town doesn't let anyone go." I didn't wait to hear more. I jumped back into my car, my hands shaking as I floored the gas. The fog seemed to part in front of me as I sped down the road, the figures fading into the mist behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, maybe days. The fog never lifted, and the roads never changed. Every turn I made brought me back to the same place, the heart of Blackwater. The buildings were always there, looming out of the mist like silent sentinels waiting. I don't know how long I've been here. Days blur into nights, and the fog never lifts. The figures watch me now, always just at the edge of the mist, never getting closer, but never leaving either. The town doesn't want me to leave, and I've realized now that I can't. There's no escape from Blackwater. If you ever find yourself driving through the Appalachian Mountains and see a sign for Blackwater, turn around. Don't stop. Don't look for help, because once you're here, there's no going back. I still don't know why I decided to visit Hollow Creek. The name itself wasn't familiar, and the map had shown it as nothing more than a dot along a forgotten stretch of highway in the Midwest. But when my car broke down on a long road trip back to Chicago, the nearest tow company directed me to this small, seemingly innocent town. I figured I'd be in and out within a day, just long enough to get my car fixed and grab a bite to eat. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was late afternoon when I rolled into Hollow Creek, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No kids playing, no dogs barking, no sounds of traffic, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. The streets were lined with old, worn-out houses, most of them, looking like they hadn't been lived in for years. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should, creeping across the ground, like fingers reaching for something. I parked in front of the town's only gas station, which looked as ancient as the rest of the town. The pump handles were rusted, and the open sign in the window flickered weakly, as if it might go out at any moment. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, but no one was behind the counter. The shelves were half empty, filled with old dust-covered snacks, and the place smelled faintly of gasoline and something musty like damp earth. "Hello," I called out, but there was no answer. I wandered toward the back, hoping someone would appear, maybe an attendant, who could point me toward a mechanic. As I turned a corner, I saw him, an old man sitting in a chair, hunched over with his back to me. He didn't move when I entered, just sat there, his shoulders rising and falling in a slow, labored rhythm. Excuse me," I said cautiously. "I'm looking for a mechanic." My car broke down a few miles outside of town. The old man's head tilted slightly, but he didn't turn around. I took a step closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. Something about him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His breathing was shallow, like he was struggling to draw air. "I just need directions." I tried again. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "Ain't no leaving Hollow Creek once you've come." My stomach dropped. What do you mean? The man let out a soft chuckle, one that sent a shiver racing down my spine slowly. He stood, but still didn't turn to face me. Folks, don't just pass through here, he rasped. You've been drawn in just like the rest of us. I backed up a step, heart pounding. What are you talking about? Before he could answer, the bell above the door chimed again. I turned and saw a figure enter, a woman pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, her clothes faded, as if she'd been walking through the dust for years. Her gaze locked onto me, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. You should leave, she whispered, though her words contradicted the old man's warning. If you can still leave, you need to do it now. I don't understand, I stammered, but she stepped closer, her hands trembling. They don't like it when new blood comes, she said, her voice shaking. Once the sun sets, you're theirs. The old man finally turned, his face twisted into a grim smile. Too late. For that, darling, he said softly, his eyes dark and empty. The shadows know you're here now. I bolted for the door, my heart racing, panic gripping me as I burst outside. The sky was nearly dark. Now, the last traces of sunlight disappearing behind the horizon. The air had turned cold, unnaturally cold, and the town seemed even more deserted than before. But something was different. The shadows, they were moving at first. I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I looked closer, I saw them, the shadows of the buildings, of the trees, of the cars. They were stretching, twisting unnaturally, like they were alive. They slithered across the ground, inching toward me, and with them came a low, guttural whispering that I couldn't quite make out. But the sound made my skin crawl. I jumped into my car, desperate to escape, but the engine wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but nothing happened. The shadows were getting closer now, creeping up the sides of the buildings, swirling around the street like a living, breathing entity, frantic. I looked for a place to hide. That's when I saw it. A small hotel at the edge of the town, its neon sign flickering like a weak heartbeat. I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my backpack and ran the shadows, nipping at my heels as I sprinted toward the entrance. The door was unlocked, and I slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lobby was empty, just like everywhere else in Hollow Creek. But there was something worse here. The air was thick, heavy with a feeling of being watched, and it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. Into the far corner of the room. I still don't know why I decided to visit Hollow Creek. The name wasn't familiar, and it appeared as just a dot on a map of a forgotten stretch of highway in the Midwest. But when my car broke down during a long trip back to Chicago, the towing company directed me to this small town. I thought I would go in and out of Hollow Creek within a day, just long enough to fix my car and grab a snack. But things didn't go as planned. It was afternoon when I entered the town, and the first thing that struck me was the eerie quiet. There were no children playing, no barking dogs, and no sounds of traffic, just a heavy silence. The streets were lined with old, dilapidated houses, most of which looked as if they hadn't been inhabited for years. The sun was setting, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to crawl across the ground. I stopped in front of the only gas station in town, which appeared as old and worn as the rest of the town, with rusty pump handles and a flickering sign that looked like it might go out at any moment. I stepped inside, and the bell above the door chimed softly, but there was no one behind the counter. The shelves were half empty, filled with old snacks, and the place had a faint smell of gasoline mixed with something musty. I called out, but there was no answer. I wandered toward the back, hoping to find someone who could help me. Around the corner, I spotted an old man sitting in a chair. He didn't move when I entered, just sat there, lost in thought. I approached him, a strange feeling creeping up my spine. "Excuse me," I said cautiously. "I'm looking for a mechanic. My car broke down a few miles outside of town." The old man tilted his head slightly but didn't turn to face me. As I stepped closer, I tried to ask again. "I just need directions." Finally, he spoke in a raspy voice. "Don't leave Hollow Creek once you arrive." I froze. "What do you mean?" The old man let out a faint chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Here, people don't pass through without reason." I stepped back, my heart racing. Before I could ask anything else, a pale, thin woman with sunken eyes walked in. Her clothes were faded, as if she had been walking through dust for years. She looked at me with a sense of dread, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. "You need to leave," she whispered, "if you still can." I didn't understand what she meant, but she approached me, her hands trembling. "They don't like it when new blood comes in." Her words were strange, yet there was something in her tone that made me feel uneasy. Then the old man turned to me with a grim smile. "It's too late now. The shadows know you're here." I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. I rushed toward the door, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the sky was darkening quickly. The air had turned cold, and the town appeared more lifeless than before. But strange shadows began to move, as if they were watching me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I looked closer, I saw the shadows twisting unnaturally, as if they were alive. I sprinted toward my car, but the engine wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but nothing happened. The shadows were now creeping closer, crawling across the street. I felt panic rising, but I had no choice but to seek refuge. I spotted a small motel on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering like a weak heartbeat. I dashed toward the entrance and slammed the door behind me. The lobby was empty, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air. In the far corner of the room stood a tall, thin figure, its face obscured by shadows. I felt paralyzed, as if it were watching me. Despite my fear, I knew I had to find an escape, but the whispers grew louder, as if they were closing in on me. I stood before a door, desperately wanting to flee. But as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The room was empty, except for an old bed and a single chair. Panic surged within me as the whispers filled the room, rising in volume. I began to feel trapped. Then, more figures emerged from the shadows, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They whispered in unison, their voices merging into a horrifying chorus, warning me not to stay any longer. Fear tightened around my throat, choking off my words before they could form, but it was too late. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in a cold, suffocating grip. I struggled, but there was no escape. The figures reached out, their icy hands pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the twisted face of the old man from the gas station smiling at me as the shadows consumed me completely. I am still here, trapped in endless darkness. If you ever find yourself lost on a back road and see a sign pointing to Hollow Creek, turn back before the shadows find you, because once they do, there's no way back.